She works in the forest and knows how the cold behaves. When she was left alone in the mountains, she built a strange structure out of firewood around her house. Her neighbors decided she had gone mad. She continued silently and waited for winter. But when the frosts came, it became clear that her work had taught her something that no one else around her knew. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. By the time the first real snow arrived, she already knew that this place would not forgive routine thinking. The mountains did not announce their intentions loudly. They worked quietly, patiently, reshaping habits, exposing assumptions, and punishing anything built for averages rather than extremes. The cabin stood on a narrow shelf of land between a steep forested slope and a drop that fell away into a ravine, where wind gathered strength before rushing upward again, funneled by stone and trees into something sharper than cold alone. On maps, the location looked harmless, a simple point marked among hundreds of others. But standing there in early winter, she understood why previous occupants had never stayed long. The forest around the cabin was dense but uneven. Old conifers leaned at slight angles, shaped by decades of prevailing wind, their branches heavier on one side, bark polished smooth where ice-laden gusts had scoured them year after year. Snow did not settle evenly here. It gathered in thick, heavy drifts, where air slowed, then vanished entirely from exposed ground, leaving frozen soil bare and hard as iron. Some mornings the temperature hovered just below freezing, only to plunge by nightfall as damp air rolled up from lower valleys, condensing on every surface. It wasn't the clean, dry cold people imagined when they thought of winter survival. It was a wet cold, persistent and invasive, creeping into joints, seams, and materials that had no business being trusted so easily. The cabin itself had been described as functional in the paperwork. That word appeared several times in the transfer documents, as if repetition might make it true. It was a modest structure, rectangular, built decades earlier to serve rotating staff assigned to monitor forest conditions and seasonal fire risk. Thick enough walls, standard insulation, a single wood-burning stove positioned where the plan said it should be, and a roof pitched steeply enough to shed snow under normal conditions. Everything about it reflected compliance rather than understanding. It met the guidelines. It passed inspections. It had survived previous winters. But survival, she had learned over the years, was a low bar. She had arrived in late autumn, when the forest still held color and the ground had not yet hardened. At that time, the cabin felt almost welcoming. The stove drew well. The interior warmed quickly in the evenings. During the day, she worked outside, walking transects, checking old fire scars, noting how vegetation had recovered in some places and failed in others. This was her job, and she was good at it. She had spent more than 20 years studying how systems failed under stress, how small, overlooked factors became decisive when conditions shifted just enough. Wind, moisture, fuel load. These were not abstract concepts to her. They were patterns she recognized instinctively, the way some people recognized faces in a crowd. She had chosen this assignment deliberately. After years of meetings, reports, and controlled environments, she wanted to work somewhere that did not pretend to be tame. The isolation did not bother her. What unsettled her, even before winter fully arrived, was how often she found herself compensating for the cabin rather than relying on it. On calm days, it held heat acceptably. On windy ones, she felt cold fingers of air probing invisible gaps. At night, the stove demanded attention sooner than it should have, the fire dying faster than calculations suggested. She took notes, mental at first, then written. The problem, she suspected, was not the stove, nor the walls, nor even the insulation. It was the way the building stood exposed, alone against forces it was never designed to manage continuously. Her firewood was stacked according to best practice, or so the manuals claimed. Split hardwood, seasoned through the summer, stacked neatly under a freestanding shelter a short distance from the cabin. The ground beneath was cleared. The top was covered. Air could circulate. Every box was checked. She had supervised similar setups dozens of times, had approved them, had recommended them to others. In theory, nothing should have gone wrong. In practice, the first serious storms told a different story. Wind-driven snow found its way under the shelter roof and settled against the stacks. Melt during brief warm spells soaked the outer layers, only to freeze again overnight. Each cycle added weight and density, turning once dry splits into something closer to frozen masonry. When she carried armloads inside, the wood felt wrong in her hands. Too heavy. Too cold. When she struck two pieces together, the sound was dull, not sharp. The stove responded poorly, hissing and steaming before flames finally took hold, wasting heat at the moment it was needed most. She told herself it was temporary, that conditions would stabilize. Instead, they worsened. The wind rose more often now, not in dramatic gusts, but in steady pressure that never seemed to rest. It pressed against the cabin walls, searched for weaknesses, and found them. On those days, no amount of careful tending could keep the interior comfortable for long. Heat escaped faster than it should have. The fire demanded more fuel, more frequently, and that fuel was becoming harder to use. What troubled her most was the familiarity of the situation. She had seen this pattern before, not here, but elsewhere. Remote dwellings that technically met standards, yet failed under sustained stress. Homes where people insisted they had enough wood, enough insulation, enough preparation, right up until the moment they didn't. In reports, the cause was often recorded as extreme weather. She had signed off on that wording herself more than once. Standing in the cabin now, watching the fire struggle against damp fuel, she understood how incomplete that explanation was. The forest did not care about averages. It dealt only in what actually happened. Wind followed terrain, not guidelines. Moisture moved where pressure and temperature allowed. The cabin stood naked in the flow, its walls taking the full force of moving air, its fuel stored separately, exposed to the same conditions that were undermining the structure itself. She began to see the flaw not as a single mistake, but as a way of thinking that divided problems that were, in reality, inseparable. She spent long evenings listening to the wind change pitch as it moved through the trees, noting how it accelerated in certain directions and softened in others. She watched how snow accumulated against natural barriers, how fallen logs created calm pockets where drifts stayed light and dry beneath the surface crust. She paid attention to where ice formed first and where it lingered longest. These were the same observations she had taught younger colleagues to make in training courses, but now they were no longer theoretical. They were personal. The cabin creaked occasionally, a low sound, not alarming yet, but insistent. She tightened what she could, sealed obvious gaps, adjusted the stove damper. Each fix helped a little, but none addressed the underlying issue. The structure was reacting to the environment instead of shaping it, and her fuel, the very thing meant to provide security through winter, was suffering the same exposure. By the time the first truly cold night arrived, when the temperature dropped sharply and stayed there, she understood that continuing as she was would mean fighting the same battle every day until spring, assuming nothing failed outright before then. She lay awake, listening to the wind rake the outer walls, feeling the fire's heat fade sooner than it should have, and recognized a professional truth that was also deeply personal. This place demanded a different solution, one that acknowledged the realities of wind, moisture, and sustained cold, instead of pretending they could be managed with minimal effort. The manuals on her shelf offered no answers. They described houses in general, climates in broad categories, and solutions optimized for cost and convenience. None of them accounted for this narrow shelf of land, this constant movement of air, this relentless exchange of moisture. As dawn came, pale and colorless through the trees, she rose and stepped outside, boots crunching on frozen ground. She looked at the cabin, at the wood shelter beyond it, at the space between them where wind cut freely, and for the first time allowed herself to consider that the problem was not that she had done something wrong, but that she had done exactly what everyone else did, in places where doing the same thing was not enough. The realization did not arrive with excitement or fear. It came with clarity. This winter would not be survived by repeating instructions. It would require understanding the place on its own terms and reshaping her approach accordingly. The idea did not arrive suddenly, and it did not announce itself as a solution. It began as unease, the same quiet discomfort she had felt many times before when reviewing incident reports that never quite explained what they claimed to explain. Standing outside the cabin after that cold night, she recognized the familiar gap between procedure and reality. She had followed the rules. She had built and stored and prepared exactly as recommended, and yet the system as a whole was failing, not catastrophically, but persistently, in the way that wears people down long before it breaks them. Her work had taught her to distrust single causes. Over the years, she had investigated burned-out cabins where owners insisted the stove was defective, only to discover drafts that pulled flames sideways and overheated flues. She had read reports from mountain regions where people froze despite full woodsheds because their fuel had absorbed moisture slowly and invisibly until it became useless. Again and again, she had seen the same pattern. People blamed the cold, the storm, the bad luck of a harsh season. Rarely did they examine the quiet decisions made months earlier that had left them exposed when conditions turned against them. As she walked the perimeter of her own cabin that morning, boots tracing the same path she had used during inspections elsewhere, those memories rose unbidden. She remembered a ranger station farther north where the staff had stacked their firewood neatly behind the building, trusting a tarp and distance to keep it safe. When an early winter rain froze overnight, the wood became a solid mass, impossible to separate without power tools. She remembered a remote research outpost where the interior temperature dropped steadily every night, despite constant feeding of the stove, because wind stripped heat faster than fuel could replace it. In each case, the official conclusion cited extreme weather. In each case, she had known that the weather had only revealed weaknesses already present. Wind, she thought again. Wind was never treated seriously enough. People spoke of it as discomfort, as something that made cold feel colder, but rarely as the primary force it was. Wind carried moisture. Wind forced air into places it did not belong. Wind robbed structures of warmth, even when insulation was technically sufficient. She had lectured on this. She had drawn diagrams on whiteboards showing pressure differentials and heat loss. Yet even she had accepted a simple wood shelter and a separate cabin as good enough here, because that was how it was always done. The problem was not ignorance. It was habit. Generations of building practice had trained people to divide functions neatly. House here, wood there. Shelter for living, shelter for fuel, each considered independently. It worked often enough to feel reliable, especially in places where winter arrived clean and dry. But this mountain forest did not offer that kind of winter. It offered movement, saturation, and repetition. Wet snow followed by freezing. Calm followed by wind. Margins eroded slowly. Then suddenly, she stopped near the wood shelter and ran a gloved hand along the outer layer of stacked splits. Beneath the thin crust of ice, She could feel the softness where moisture had penetrated. This was not a failure of seasoning. The wood had been properly cut and dried. It was a failure of exposure. The fuel was being asked to defend itself against the same forces that were attacking the cabin, without any meaningful protection beyond distance, and a roof that did nothing to stop wind. That thought lingered as she returned inside and sat by the stove, notebook open on her knee. She began writing not solutions, but observations. Wind direction during storms, areas of snow buildup, how long it took for the interior temperature to drop once the fire weakened. She wrote about the sound of the wind as well, how it changed pitch depending on where it struck the structure. This was not sentiment. Sound carried information. She had learned that long ago in burned forests, where wind noise could signal dangerous shifts before flames ever appeared. Her notes began to circle a central idea she had resisted at first. The cabin was standing alone when it did not need to be. In nature, isolation was rare. Animals nested within layers. Trees grew in groups not only because seeds fell close together, but because shared shelter increased survival. Even rocks piled against one another altered wind patterns, creating pockets of relative calm. Nothing endured here without some form of buffering. She remembered a winter survey years earlier, conducted with an indigenous guide, whose quiet competence had impressed her more than any formal training session. They had taken shelter during a storm, not in a single enclosed space, but within a layered structure built against a rock face. An outer barrier broke the wind. An inner space held warmth. The guide had explained it simply. "You do not fight winter," he had said. "You step aside from it." At the time, she had nodded, appreciating the wisdom without fully applying it beyond that moment. Now, in her own cabin, that memory returned with force. The problem was not that the house lost heat, or that the wood absorbed moisture. The problem was that both were being asked to function in direct contact with the same hostile environment. They were separate when they should have been part of a single system. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the narrow band of space between the cabin wall and the surrounding forest. Snow drifted unevenly there, thinner in some spots, deeper in others, revealing where wind slowed and where it accelerated. She imagined what would happen if that space were no longer empty, if instead of open air, it were filled with material that both blocked wind and benefited from protection. The thought felt unfamiliar, almost improper, because it reversed the usual order. People protected houses first, then worried about fuel. She wondered what would happen if fuel became part of the protection. The idea unsettled her because it challenged more than construction habits. It challenged a mindset. Duct tape solutions, quick shelters, and seasonal compromises were deeply ingrained in remote living culture. They were defended not because they were optimal, but because they were familiar and inexpensive. To do otherwise invited scrutiny, questions, and the quiet judgment reserved for those who appeared to overbuild, in places where minimalism was considered virtuous. She had seen this resistance before, too. In wildfire mitigation projects, where residents resisted clearing brush because it disrupted the look of their property. In flood zones, where people ignored elevation recommendations because previous floods had spared them. Experience bred confidence, but not always wisdom, and she was not immune to it herself. As the day wore on, she reviewed her notes from past assignments, flipping through weather records and site analyses she had kept over the years. The same conclusions appeared repeatedly, scattered across different regions and incidents. Systems that acknowledged wind early performed better under stress. Storage integrated into protective envelopes stayed usable longer. Structures that treated heat, moisture, and fuel as interconnected endured where others failed. By evening, the stove demanded attention again, and she fed it carefully chosen pieces from the inner stack. saving the heavier, wetter splits for later, when they might dry somewhat near the fire. It was an inefficient process, one she recognized from case studies she had once analyzed from a distance. Living it now sharpened her frustration, but it also clarified her resolve. She sat by the fire long after night fell, listening to the wind rise once more. Outside, snow moved sideways, driven by forces that did not pause or negotiate. Inside, warmth ebbed steadily, predictable in its decline. She closed her notebook and rested her hands on its cover, feeling the rough paper beneath her palms. The solution, she realized, would not come from improving one component. It would come from changing the relationship between them. The house could no longer stand apart from its fuel. The fuel could no longer be treated as a separate concern. Winter demanded coherence, not convenience. The thought followed her as she lay down to sleep, the wind pressing close against the walls. Somewhere between waking and rest, an image formed in her mind, not yet detailed, but persistent. A house no longer exposed on all sides, a space around it that worked, not against the cold, but with it. She did not yet know how she would build it, or what others might say. She only knew that continuing as before was no longer an option, and that the habits she had trusted for years were about to be tested by the same professional skepticism she had once applied to others. The decision did not come with certainty, only with a quiet sense of inevitability. After days of observing, measuring, remembering, and doubting the habits she herself had once defended, she reached a point where hesitation felt more dangerous than action. Winter was no longer approaching. It had arrived, and it was already teaching its lessons with steady insistence. If she was going to change anything, it had to be now, while there was still time to correct mistakes before the season closed in completely. She began, as she always did, with measurements, not guesses, not rough impressions, but numbers. She walked the perimeter of the cabin with a tape measure, noting distances, angles, the way the ground sloped away on one side and pressed close on the other. She marked where wind struck hardest, where snow piled deepest, where meltwater lingered longest before freezing again. The cabin was small enough that the work did not take long, but she repeated it anyway, checking her figures against the reality she could feel under her boots and see in the trees. The idea, once written down, looked almost laughable in its simplicity. A continuous structure built around the cabin, set a short distance away from the walls, creating a ring of protected space. Not a second house, not an addition meant for living, but a shell whose primary function would be to break wind and control moisture before either could reach the structure inside. And within that shell, stacked methodically and deliberately, the very fuel that had been failing her. Firewood, arranged not as an afterthought, but as a functional layer in the system. She stared at the sketch in her notebook for a long time, aware of how it would appear to anyone else. Firewood stored around a house, walls wrapped in fuel. It went against every instinct drilled into people through safety briefings and conventional wisdom. Wood belonged at a distance, people said. Combustible materials should never be close to living spaces. Yet, even as those warnings echoed in her mind, she recalled the countless homes lost not because wood had been too close, but because it had been too wet, too inaccessible, too useless when it was needed most. The difference, she knew, lay in control. Fire was dangerous when unmanaged. Moisture was destructive when ignored. Wind was lethal when allowed to move freely. Her plan did not deny these truths. It acknowledged them directly. The space she envisioned would not trap heat recklessly or press fuel against the cabin walls. It would breathe. Air would move slowly, deliberately, upward and out, carrying moisture away without allowing wind to drive snow inward. The wood would be elevated, sorted, accessible, and constantly shielded from the worst of the weather. She began construction the next morning. The first posts went in while the ground was still workable. She dug by hand, choosing placement carefully, setting each support far enough from the cabin to allow movement, but close enough to form an effective barrier. The labor was physical, steady, and familiar in its demands. She had spent years working alongside crews in far worse conditions, and the rhythm of digging, lifting, setting, and packing felt grounding. Each post marked a commitment. There was no halfway version of this idea. Either it would be done properly, or it would not be done at all. As the framework began to take shape, the reactions came, just as she had expected. A colleague stopped by one afternoon to drop off supplies and stood silently for a long moment, looking at the growing outline around the cabin. He asked no questions at first, only walked the perimeter once, boots crunching in the thin crust of snow. When he finally spoke, his tone carried more curiosity than approval. He asked what she was building. She answered plainly. "A wind buffer," she said. "Storage. Protection." He frowned, eyes narrowing slightly, and mentioned fire risk. She listened without interrupting, then explained the clearances she was maintaining, the airflow she intended to preserve, the way the structure would prevent snow accumulation against the cabin walls rather than encourage it. He nodded slowly, unconvinced, but thoughtful, and eventually changed the subject. When he left, she knew the story would spread, stripped of its reasoning and reduced to its most unusual element. The woman was building something strange around her house. The woman was storing wood where it didn't belong. By the end of the first week, the outline was unmistakable. Upright supports encircled the cabin, connected by beams that hinted at the roof to come. The space between inner and outer boundaries felt neither cramped nor excessive. It was enough to move through comfortably, enough to stack material in an organized way, enough to create the separation she needed between winter and warmth. The roof came next, sloping outward, away from the cabin, shedding snow before it could gather weight or drive inward under pressure. She worked carefully, calculating pitch not for appearance, but for performance. Too steep, and it would demand more material than she could spare. Too shallow, and it would invite accumulation. The angle she chose was conservative, proven, unremarkable to anyone else, but to her it represented balance. This was not a statement piece. It was a tool. As boards went up and the structure began to enclose itself, she paid close attention to how the wind behaved. Already, she could feel the difference. Gusts that once struck the cabin directly now met resistance, diverted upward or slowed before reaching the inner wall. Snow began to behave differently as well, collecting along the outer edge instead of pressing against the cabin itself. The change was subtle, but undeniable. The interior organization came last, and it was here that her professional habits asserted themselves most clearly. She did not simply stack wood. She sorted it. Hardwoods closer to the cabin entrance, lighter material farther out. Each stack rested on supports that lifted it from the ground, allowing air to circulate beneath. Gaps between rows were intentional, not careless. Moisture needed a path to escape. She left it one. Ventilation openings near the roofline allowed damp air to rise and exit, invisible from a distance, but essential to the system's success. She tested them repeatedly, opening and closing, adjusting until she was satisfied that snow could not be driven in, but air could always find its way out. The structure, though unfinished, already felt alive in a way the cabin alone never had. It responded to conditions rather than resisting them blindly. There were moments, late in the day, when exhaustion set in. That doubt crept close. She would step back and look at the cabin now partially hidden within its growing shell, and wonder if she had gone too far, if she had allowed theory to override caution, if she was building a monument to overthinking. But then she would remember the wet wood, the failing fires, the reports she had read too many times, and the doubt would recede. By the time the first full ring of firewood was stacked, the structure had taken on a new identity. The cabin no longer appeared isolated. It felt nested, protected not by distance, but by intention. She moved through the space easily, retrieving tools, adjusting stacks, testing airflow with her bare hand. The wind still howled beyond the outer wall, but inside the ring it softened, losing its edge, becoming background rather than threat. Others noticed the change before winter fully tightened its grip. Another colleague stopped by, then a local contractor who worked seasonal jobs in the area. Their reactions followed a pattern she recognized well. First disbelief, then questions, then, quietly, calculation. They paced the space, looked at the roof angle, the clearances, the way the wood was stored. No one laughed outright, but the skepticism lingered in the air. She did not argue. She did not defend herself beyond simple explanations. The structure would either work or it would not. Winter would decide, and Winter did not care about opinions. As the last boards went into place and the first real cold settled in for good, she stood inside the enclosed space and listened. The wind struck the outer wall and broke. Its force dissipated before it could reach the cabin. Snow hissed against the roof and slid away. The air within the ring felt still, not warm exactly, but calmer, drier, more predictable. For the first time since arriving, she felt that the cabin was no longer standing alone against the season. It was part of a system now, one that acknowledged the reality she had spent her career studying. Whether others understood it, yet did not matter. What mattered was that the solution, however strange it appeared, had been built with intention, grounded in experience rather than habit. Winter had been invited closer, but on new terms. The real test did not announce itself with drama. There was no sudden whiteout, no headline-worthy storm that arrived all at once. Winter settled in the way it always did in the mountains, patiently and without apology, tightening its grip day by day until resistance became exhausting. The temperature dropped in small, deliberate steps, each colder night erasing the memory of the last mild afternoon. Snow came not in spectacular bursts, but in persistent layers, light at first, then heavier, packing itself into every hollow the landscape offered. She noticed the difference immediately. Before, every shift in weather had demanded her attention. A change in wind direction meant drafts along the cabin walls. A wet snowfall meant damp wood by morning. Freeze and thaw cycles turned stacked logs into stubborn, icy blocks that refused to burn cleanly. Now, the routine changed. She woke each morning to the same quiet stability inside the cabin. The stove caught quickly. The fire burned evenly. Smoke rose cleanly from the chimney instead of clinging low and bitter to the air. The firewood told the story before anything else did. Each piece she pulled from the sheltered stacks felt lighter than it should have, dry to the touch even after nights when the outer walls were plastered with snow. The sound it made when it struck the hearth was sharp and clear, not the dull thud of moisture-hidden weight. The flames responded instantly, bright and steady, heat rolling outward instead of struggling upward, in weak, smoky spirals. She kept notes without making a show of it. Old habits died hard. Temperatures inside the cabin, outside the structure, within the enclosed ring. Wind speeds measured against the outer wall and again near the cabin door. The differences were consistent, not dramatic in a way that begged for attention, but undeniable. The outer shell absorbed punishment. The inner space remained predictable. The first serious storm arrived late one evening, driven in from the higher elevations, with a force that reminded her why the mountains were never forgiving of mistakes. Wind screamed through the treetops, bending branches until snow shook loose in sudden, blinding sheets. The sound against the outer structure was constant, a low roar punctuated by sharp impacts as ice-laced gusts drove snow sideways into wood. Inside the cabin, she listened without tension. She fed the stove at intervals that felt almost leisurely compared to previous winters. The fire did not demand constant attention. The heat held, soaking into the stone and timber, radiating back long after the flames settled into glowing coals. When she stepped into the enclosed space to retrieve more wood, the contrast was striking. Outside the shell, the storm was violent, directionless, punishing. Inside, the air moved slowly, deliberately, carrying dampness upward and out, rather than forcing it inward. By morning, the outer walls were buried halfway up in snow. Drifts pressed hard against the structure, packed dense by wind. She expected resistance when she opened the door, but the space inside remained accessible. Snow had piled where it was meant to, not where it could cause damage. The wood stacks stood untouched, dry, their edges sharp and clean. Later that day, someone came on snowshoes, moving awkwardly through drifts that reached past the knee. A neighbor she knew only casually, someone who had built his place farther down the slope, knocked on the door with a hesitation that bordered on embarrassment. He asked, carefully, if she had spare kindling. His voice carried the strain of someone who had spent the night fighting a losing battle with damp fuel. She said nothing at first, only nodded and stepped into the sheltered ring. The difference in his posture was immediate. His shoulders eased. He glanced around, eyes drawn to the stacked wood, the clear ground beneath it, the absence of ice. He did not comment, but the look lingered. She handed him an armful of splits and watched as he turned them over in his gloves, testing the weight, the feel. He left quickly, but not before casting one more glance at the structure as a whole, as if committing it to memory. The storm passed, but winter stayed. Weeks followed in which the pattern repeated itself. Snowstorms came and went. Freezing rain glazed the outer walls, then slid away. Wind howled through the valley, stripped heat from exposed surfaces, and left the enclosed space largely undisturbed. Each event reinforced the same lesson. The structure did not eliminate winter. It made winter manageable. She noticed changes in herself as well. The constant calculation, the background anxiety about fuel and failure, faded. She slept more deeply. Her movements slowed, not from cold, but from confidence. She no longer rushed tasks that could be done deliberately. The cabin felt less like a temporary outpost and more like a place that could endure. Word traveled, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. Questions followed. How far from the wall had she set the supports? How she had angled the roof? Whether the wood ever froze? Whether she worried about fire? She answered when asked, plainly and without embellishment. The system worked because it respected basic principles, not because it was clever. Wind slowed, moisture redirected, fuel protected. One afternoon, during a rare stretch of clear weather, two people arrived together. One was a forestry contractor she had crossed paths with, professionally, years earlier. The other was younger, unfamiliar, his interest sharper, less cautious. They walked the perimeter together, measured with their eyes, discussed quietly in half-finished sentences. She listened without interrupting, recognizing the moment for what it was. Skepticism was giving way to analysis. The younger man asked what had pushed her to build it this way. The question caught her off guard. She considered the answer carefully before responding. Experience, she said. Not theory. She had seen what failed over and over in environments that punished assumptions. She had learned that survival often depended less on strength than on preparation that anticipated the worst instead of hoping for the average. That night, As the temperature dropped again, and the cabin settled into its familiar rhythm of warmth and quiet, she realized something had shifted. The structure was no longer an experiment. It had become a fact. It had endured enough to earn trust, not only hers, but others. Winter continued its slow advance, deeper and colder, but now it did so against something built to meet it on equal terms. The enclosed space around the cabin held steady, its function proven not by explanation, but by repetition. Each storm reinforced the same outcome: dry wood, reliable heat, predictable shelter. She knew then that the next test would not be weather alone. It would be attention. And attention, she understood well, could be just as demanding. Attention arrived quietly at first, disguised as coincidence. Someone happened to be passing by more often. A truck slowed on the access road instead of continuing downhill. Footprints appeared near the outer wall after fresh snowfall, not careless wanderings, but deliberate paths that circled the structure before retreating. She noticed these things the way she noticed changes in wind patterns or snow density, without judgment, simply as data. The system was no longer invisible. It was being observed. The first formal request came from someone she did not expect. A regional safety coordinator, officially off duty, arrived with a thermos and a notebook, claiming curiosity rather than authority. He walked slowly, hands clasped behind his back, tracing the perimeter with his eyes. He asked about clearances, about how heat behaved inside the ring, about airflow during freezing rain. He did not argue or offer opinions. He listened, wrote, nodded, and returned to his vehicle with the same quiet he had brought with him. After that, the questions multiplied. Some came from people who framed them as favors. Others arrived cloaked in professional language, careful and precise, as if acknowledging the structure's success too openly might reflect poorly on past recommendations. She answered them all the same way, calmly, without defensiveness. She explained what she had built, why she had built it, and what it did and did not do. She was careful not to claim perfection. The structure did not create heat. It did not defy winter. It simply reduced loss and protected resources in a way conventional thinking had neglected. What surprised her was not the interest itself, but the speed with which it spread. By midwinter, people she had never met were referencing her cabin in conversations she overheard at supply depots and maintenance yards. They spoke about that place with the wood inside the shell, or the woman who wrapped her cabin instead of stacking outside. The details varied, but the core remained intact. Someone had built differently, and the difference was working. She began to receive requests for visits, not tours exactly, but quiet walkthroughs. People arrived alone or in pairs, careful not to draw attention, their curiosity tempered by the awareness that admitting interest meant admitting doubt about their own methods. She did not refuse them. She had never believed knowledge improved by hoarding. During these visits, she learned as much as she taught. She heard stories of failed winters, of cabins lost not to fire but to rot, of families who had abandoned properties because heating them had become an endless, losing battle. She recognized the patterns immediately: wind exposure ignored, moisture underestimated, fuel treated as static rather than dynamic. The same mistakes repeated across terrain and time, reinforced by habit instead of evidence. One visitor stayed longer than the others. A woman close to her own age, dressed in gear that bore the marks of long use rather than fashion, moved through the enclosed space with an expression of concentration so familiar it felt like looking into a mirror. She touched the wood stacks, crouched to examine the supports, tilted her head to listen to how sound changed beneath the roof. When she finally spoke, it was not a question, but a statement. This was about control, she said. Not comfort alone. Control over variables everyone else surrendered to chance. That night, after the visitor left, she sat by the stove longer than usual, thinking about that word. Control. It carried weight, both practical and emotional. She had built the structure to manage heat and moisture, but she had also built it to reclaim something less tangible. Predictability, confidence, the ability to plan beyond the next storm. As winter deepened, the structure continued to perform with unremarkable consistency. That consistency was what drew attention now. No emergency calls, no desperate fuel shortages, no frantic repairs after storms passed. The absence of crisis was, in its own way, remarkable. One evening, during a prolonged cold stretch that pushed temperatures well below seasonal averages, a call came through the radio network she monitored for work-related updates. A small team had been delayed in the upper valley, their temporary shelter compromised by wind and ice. They were not in immediate danger, but their fuel supply was deteriorating faster than expected. The request was indirect, phrased carefully. Could she spare a few days' worth of dry wood? She did not hesitate. They arrived before dawn, tired and wary, and she led them into the enclosed space without ceremony. The reaction was immediate. Relief, first, then disbelief. They loaded what they needed quickly, aware of time and cold. But before leaving, they asked questions in rushed fragments. How long had it taken to build? How much material it required? Whether it could be adapted to temporary structures. She answered what she could, promising more later, and watched them disappear back into the trees with a sense of quiet satisfaction. The structure had done more than protect her. It had become a resource. The following weeks blurred into a rhythm defined less by survival and more by refinement. She adjusted minor elements, redirected airflow slightly where condensation threatened, reinforced areas that bore more snow load than anticipated. None of these changes altered the core design. They refined it. Each adjustment made the system more resilient, more adaptable, without sacrificing its simplicity. By late winter, the conversations changed tone. People stopped asking whether it worked. They asked how to replicate it. Some wanted to adapt it to cabins already built. Others spoke of incorporating similar principles into new construction. She listened, offered guidance where appropriate, and cautioned against shortcuts. The system functioned as a whole. Removing or simplifying elements without understanding their purpose would undermine its effectiveness. One afternoon, as daylight stretched just a little longer and the cold eased its grip, she stood inside the enclosed space and realized she no longer thought of it as separate from the cabin. It was not an addition. It was an extension of how the place interacted with its environment. The boundary between structure and landscape had shifted, becoming layered rather than abrupt. The attention did not overwhelm her, but it changed her understanding of what she had done. What began as a personal solution had become an example, not because she had sought recognition, but because the conditions that demanded the solution were shared by many. The same winter pressed against every wall. The same mistakes repeated themselves until someone demonstrated an alternative. As snow began to soften and the first signs of thaw appeared along the edges of the outer wall, she knew the final judgment of the season was approaching. Winter had tested the structure thoroughly. Spring would reveal what winter had missed. Moisture damage, hidden failures, rot or warping concealed beneath success. She welcomed that test with the same calm she had brought to the first storm. Whatever emerged when the snow receded would tell the rest of the story. Spring did not arrive as a celebration. It came cautiously, almost reluctantly, testing the ground the way winter had tested the structures built upon it. The snow retreated in stages, shrinking first from the sunlit edges of the outer wall, then loosening its grip on shaded drifts that had stood firm for months. Meltwater traced slow paths through channels carved by gravity and habit, pooling where it always had, exposing where preparation had failed elsewhere. She waited. This was the moment she trusted more than any storm. Winter revealed weaknesses through violence. Spring revealed them through patience. She walked the perimeter of the structure daily, boots sinking into softening ground, eyes trained not on what had survived, but on what might quietly give way now that pressure had changed. She checked joints, posts, fastenings. She pressed her hand against boards that had faced months of snow load and wind shear. The wood was dry, not pristine, but sound. No hidden swelling, no soft spots that betrayed trapped moisture. The vents had done their work. Air had moved when it needed to move. Water had been denied places to linger. Inside the enclosed space, the difference was even clearer. Where she had once expected the smell of dampness that marked every thaw season she could remember, there was only the clean scent of wood and earth. The firewood stacks stood unchanged, their lower rows intact rather than darkened or soft. She pulled a piece at random, split it open, and examined the grain. It showed no sign of rot, no hidden decay. The structure had not merely preserved fuel for a season, it had preserved material integrity. The cabin itself told the same story. When she inspected the walls that had once faced the full force of winter storms, she found none of the damage she had come to expect. Chinking remained tight. Logs bore no new scars from ice expansion. Even the foundation stones appeared cleaner, less disturbed by freeze-thaw cycles that normally worked moisture into every weakness. The shell had taken the abuse, so the cabin did not have to. Word spread again, but this time it was different. People did not come asking whether it worked. They came wanting to see what remained. They wanted proof that success had not been temporary, that the structure had not simply delayed inevitable damage. They arrived as snowmelt turned trails to mud, boots heavy, jackets unzipped against the unfamiliar warmth, eyes alert for signs of failure. They did not find them. She walked them through the space slowly, explaining less now than before. The structure spoke for itself. They could see the difference in the wood, in the ground beneath it, in the condition of the cabin walls. They noticed the absence of rot before she pointed it out. They noticed the airflow before she described it. Understanding no longer required persuasion. One visitor, a senior engineer from a regional planning group, lingered longer than the others. He said little, but when he finally spoke, his words carried weight. He remarked that what she had built was not innovative in the way people like to celebrate, but fundamental. He had seen versions of it before, scattered across different cultures, climates, and centuries, always rediscovered when conditions forced people to reconsider assumptions. He called it a buffered envelope, a term she recognized from her professional life, but had rarely seen applied with such clarity outside textbooks. She smiled at that. Textbooks had never kept anyone warm. As spring progressed, requests shifted again. Now people asked for drawings, for measurements, for guidance on adapting the concept to their own land. Some wanted to scale it down. Others wanted to extend it, incorporate storage beyond firewood, build workspaces that remained usable year-round. She answered carefully, aware that success invited imitation, but imitation without understanding carried its own risks. She emphasized principles over specifics. Wind must be slowed before it reached living space. Moisture must always have a path out. Fuel must be treated as a system, not a pile. She warned against shortcuts that sacrificed ventilation for convenience or clearance for appearance. The structure worked because it respected physics, not because it looked unconventional. One afternoon, as the last of the snow vanished from the shaded side of the cabin, she stood alone inside the enclosed space, and tried to remember the anxiety that had defined her arrival months earlier. It felt distant now, not erased, but transformed. She understood that the confidence she felt was not born of comfort alone. It came from alignment. The cabin, the structure around it, and the environment it stood within were no longer at odds. They worked together, each layer absorbing what it was meant to absorb. She thought about her work, about the years spent studying failures after they happened. Burned homes, collapsed shelters, systems overwhelmed by conditions their designers had not truly believed would occur. Here, she had done the opposite. She had assumed the worst and built accordingly. The result was not excess, but resilience. By early summer, the place had changed in subtle ways. The land around the cabin showed fewer scars from runoff. Soil held where it had once washed away. Vegetation returned closer to the foundation, no longer killed back by ice accumulation and saturation. The structure's influence extended beyond wood and heat. It altered how the ground itself responded to seasonal change. She documented these observations quietly, not for publication, but for herself. She knew others would draw their own conclusions. Already, similar structures were appearing at a distance, not identical, but recognizable. Rings of shelter. Covered storage integrated into living space rather than treated as an afterthought. The idea had taken root. Late one evening, as the sun lingered longer than it had any right to at that latitude, she sat on the threshold between the cabin and the enclosed space and listened. There was no wind to speak of, just the sound of insects returning, of water moving freely again. She realized that the structure had changed how she thought about permanence, not as resistance to change, but as accommodation of it. She had not built a fortress. She had built a conversation with the environment, one that acknowledged winter's power without surrendering to it. When people asked now why she had done it, she answered differently than before. She no longer spoke first of firewood, or storms, or professional experience. She spoke of attention, of paying close enough attention to see patterns others dismissed as inconvenience, of refusing to accept failure as inevitable simply because it was common. The cabin stood quietly inside its shell, unchanged in appearance, but fundamentally altered in relationship to the world around it. It would weather future winters with the same indifference it had shown the last, not because it was stronger than winter, but because it no longer challenged winter blindly. As she closed the door that night and prepared the stove for a season it would not need to work as hard to endure, she understood that what remained after the snow was not just a structure. It was proof that thoughtful preparation, grounded in observation rather than habit, could transform survival into something calmer, steadier, and enduring. Winter would return. She welcomed it. If this story made you see winter survival differently, subscribe to the channel. Watch the next video and explore other stories about real decisions that change outcomes. Share this video with someone who values practical thinking.